Hey everybody, and good evening. And I wanted to do a video I've been wanting to do for a while, which is recommendations for vintage hi-fi by category. I often get questions about, do you recommend vintage hi-fi? I'm looking at a classic receiver. What do you think about it? And, I wanted to kind of do a broad video sort of discussion about it, talking about it by category, not by specific brands or components. Because I think that kind of gets into too specific. I want to kind of make it more of a broader topic. And it is a video I've been wanting to do for a while. And I also want to say that this is just my own opinion. Other people will certainly have opinions. The old saying, opinions are like buttholes, everybody has one. But yeah, so it's just my personal thoughts on vintage hi-fi and kind of what types of components that I go for when I'm looking at vintage hi-fi. So anyway, let's talk about it. The first item on the list, of course, is receivers, and it's probably the most common component that people are looking at, the most popular of components in the vintage era. Is going to be receivers or amplifiers. Now, in my personal opinion, I typically do not recommend vintage receivers. And I tell you why, because I recently picked up this Sansui 2000. It came out in 1968. This is actually from 1969. But in any case, as soon as I get it, it develops a problem. The guy I got it from, he said, oh, it's been working great for months. I haven't had any problems with it. I even went through it and cleaned all the pots and everything. And, as soon as I get it, it has a problem. And that's my experience with vintage receivers, is that they tend to develop issues. Now, that doesn't always apply, but even recapped, refurbished, serviced units can and do have problems. I mean, look at this stuff. It's a hugely electrical object that is 40 years old, 50 years old. In the case of this, it's almost 60 years old. So it's bound to develop problems. And there's so many components in it, resistors and transistors and capacitors and diodes and Zener diodes, and just everything comes together to potentially make problems and cause problems, which is why I typically do not recommend receivers. Vintage speakers. Now, I think vintage speakers oftentimes don't get talked about a whole lot. I think from the pantheon of vintage hi-fi, people often talk about receivers and turntables and tape decks and reel-to-reels and all sorts of different things, but speakers rarely get talked about. And I think that's sort of a shame, because some of the best audio experiences that I've had have been through vintage speakers. These ones you can see back here, these are some realistic Nova 8s. These came out in 1973, and they're all original. They haven't been refurbished because they don't need to be refurbished, and they sound and perform brilliantly. They just sound fantastic, and just have a rich, warm, enveloping sound. They have some controls on the back, basically tone controls to adjust mid-range and high, but overall they sound fantastic. You honestly cannot beat them. You certainly can beat them, but I think vintage speakers are one of those things that I have rarely had problems with. Now, turntables. Now, I have sort of a weird history with vintage turntables, in the sense that, generally speaking, my personal history with turntables, vintage turntables, is that they do tend to work. I rarely have had vintage turntables that have had problems. And the nice things about vintage turntables is when they do have problems, they tend to be relatively easy to fix. It's a belt, it's something simple. Maybe it's a speed adjustment underneath, a new power cord, new RCA cables. It's something generally simple to repair. However, I don't tend to recommend vintage turntables. And the main reason being is because they do tend to have problems. And I think from the perspective of somebody getting into this hobby of vintage, of stereo, of hi-fi, and getting an item and then immediately having to go take and go have it repaired is just kind of eh. Now, when it comes to vintage turntables, the ones I do tend to recommend tend to be more of the entry-level models. They tend to be belt drive, they tend to be more manual, they tend to be more simpler. And because they're simpler, they do tend to be more reliable. This studio standard, I've had actually for a little bit of a time as a sort of a backup table, and I've had it off and on. I even gave it away at one point, and then I ended up getting it back. And, you know, it's been a fairly reliable turntable, but equally it's very simple. It is a cheap turntable, and I mean cheap. But it sounds decent enough, and speed is good. And again, you know, it's fairly reliable. When you start getting into fancy turntables, they get more complex with sensors and light elements and all kinds of stuff that, Jesus, that makes these machines far less reliable, truly far less reliable, and more prone to failure. And you often see that. Just go look on YouTube, go Google vintage turntable issues, and it tends to be on the higher end models. So while I do recommend vintage turntables, I recommend only the cheaper, more entry-level ones because they're simpler, they tend to have less problems. Vintage cassette decks, and when I say cassette decks, I should say tape deck or tape machine in the more broader sense, in the sense of not just compact cassette, but 8-track and reel-to-reel, okay? And just all the general tape formats that have come out over the years. And I don't recommend any of them. And I tell you why, because they tend to have problems, tremendous problems. Belts tend to be the big thing, obviously with cassette decks, but also reel-to-reels. A lot of reel-to-reels used belts as well, 8-tracks as well. You know, and I honestly, 8-track, I had an 8-track player at one point, and it's a cool novelty to be able to play 8 tracks, but the tapes themselves deteriorate over time, and you have to repair the tapes just to be able to play them. And it's kind of, it's like, Jesus, man, I just want to be done with this. You know, I don't want to have to repair something just to be able to listen to it, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I don't generally recommend cassette decks, with the exception of one. I like 90s Sony cassette decks. And I tell you why I like 90s Sony cassette decks, because I've had a few over the years, and I open them up and put new belts in them, and it's so simple to put belts in them. Generally, my experience, and I can't name models because I can't remember, but for the most part, you know, the whole cassette mechanism bolts in at the bottom. You unbolt it, unplug the wiring, unbolt it, take the whole mechanism out, take the back plate off the back of it, put a couple new belts on, and Bob's your uncle. Put the plate back on, bolt it on, hook the wires up, you're done. The cassette deck is fixed. And, you know, that's why that is really the only one, but that's just the exception. Generally, the rule for me is no cassette decks, no tape machines as a recommendation. So you might ask yourself, well, why aren't you recommending vintage hi-fi when you seem to have so much of it? Well, all of this has been gone through professionally, and all of it works very well. And so there's that aspect, okay? And number two, you have to understand that my point of this video is a reference for newbies, people coming into this. I recommend new products to new people, because what happens is you have the option to have a warranty, have a grace period, have the ability to return it if you don't like it. And there's so much option out there for great high quality equipment that you can get relatively cheap that performs fantastically. And so why would I recommend to somebody some 45, 50-year-old piece of equipment that as soon as they plug it in, it's going to explode, and it's just going to or it's not going to work, you know, and they're going to have issues, you know what I mean? And by the way, I have several systems. I recently put together this vintage system because I wanted to have another vintage system in the house, and I haven't had one in a while, and you know, so here we are. But anyway, peace out.